For decades, the story of the Antikythera mechanism felt complete. Archaeologists and historians had examined the corroded bronze fragments pulled from the Aegean seabed in 1901. They had identified it as an astronomical calculating device from the late Hellenistic world, a sophisticated but solitary achievement of Greek science. Textbooks described its gears and dials as remarkable examples of ancient ingenuity, nothing more. The device predicted eclipses, tracked the irregular motion of the moon, and marked the dates of the Olympic Games, using mathematical cycles known to Babylonian astronomers and refined by Greek thinkers. That account sounded reasonable on paper. It fit the timeline. It explained the object without requiring any uncomfortable adjustments to what we believe about technology in the 2nd century before Christ. Experts who studied the fragments in the quiet rooms of the National Archaeological Museum believed the mystery had already been solved. The tools were simple files and saws, the answer was comfortable, and the story seemed complete. But when the high-resolution, three-dimensional scan data from the most recent micro-CT examinations was fed into advanced pattern recognition systems, including AI models configured for technical signature analysis, the output did not simply confirm the textbook description. One set of measurements stood apart from everything the standard account had prepared researchers to expect. The numbers described a level of consistency across the gear teeth that human hands working with period tools would have struggled to maintain over hundreds of divisions without introducing drift that simply is not there. Stay with me, because once you notice this detail, the old explanation becomes much harder to accept, without asking new questions about what was really happening in those ancient workshops. The object itself rests today in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens, sealed inside climate-controlled cases under soft lighting that never changes. What remains are 82 fragments, most of them no larger than a human hand, some no larger than a coin. The largest piece still holds 27 visible gears when examined under X-ray, their triangular teeth locked in the positions they held when the sea claimed the ship. Bronze, that once gleamed with the warm color of new metal, now carries thick layers of green corrosion and mineral encrustation built up over 2,000 years underwater. The wooden case that protected the mechanism on its final voyage disintegrated long ago, leaving the delicate wheels and arbors frozen inside a protective shell of sediment and corrosion that ironically saved them from complete destruction. Divers working in cold, murky water at a depth of roughly 50 meters brought up the strange lump in 1901, along with marble statues of gods and heroes and other cargo destined for Roman collectors. At first, no one understood what the strange wheel shapes inside the concretion meant. The sponge divers who found the wreck off the tiny island of Antikythera had been looking for natural sponges, not ancient machines. Only later, when the mass was carefully split apart in the museum laboratory, did the gears appear one by one. Even then, the full complexity stayed hidden for another century, because the corrosion had fused everything into a single, unreadable block. The sea had done its work, but it had also preserved something extraordinary inside its protective shell of sediment and corrosion, something that would wait patiently for the right kind of light to reveal its secrets. The engineering challenge becomes clear the moment you consider the scale and the conditions under which the device had to function. The largest surviving gear measures about 14 centimeters across and once carried 223 triangular teeth cut with remarkable uniformity around its circumference. Each tooth stands roughly 1.6 millimeters apart at the pitch circle, a spacing so fine that a modern needle file would be required to shape it accurately. The wheels themselves average only 1.4 millimeters thick in their surviving sections, with gaps between meshing gears of about 1.2 millimeters, leaving almost no room for error or for the kind of burr that hand filing tends to leave behind. Inside the cramped wooden box that once measured perhaps 34 by 18 by 9 centimeters, multiple layers of these gears had to turn without binding, transmitting motion from a single-hand crank on the side to dials on both the front and back faces. One train calculated the metonic cycle of 19 years that brings the sun and moon back into alignment on the same calendar date. Another tracked the Saros cycle of 223 lunar months for predicting eclipse possibilities. A separate mechanism used a pin and slot arrangement to reproduce the moon's changing apparent speed as it moves through its elliptical orbit around the Earth, speeding up when closer and slowing when farther away. That last feature alone requires an understanding of variable motion and mechanical compensation that most historians associate with much later periods of European clockmaking. On paper, the official account holds together, because Greek astronomers already possessed the necessary numbers from Babylonian records and from their own careful observations over generations. Hipparchus had described the moon's anomaly in mathematical terms in the 2nd century before Christ. The cycles themselves were not new inventions. What the mechanism does is turn those abstract numbers into moving metal that anyone could watch and understand without needing to perform the calculations themselves. At first glance, the explanation feels fair and complete. A skilled bronze worker in a workshop on the island of Rhodes or in the great city of Alexandria could have filed the teeth by hand using needle files and a simple dividing plate or wooden jig to mark the positions. The mathematics existed in written tables and in the heads of trained astronomers. The demand for such a device among wealthy patrons, philosophical schools, or even navigators who wanted to understand the heavens could have existed in a world where the movements of the planets and stars carried deep cultural and practical meaning. The ship that carried it was probably bound for Rome, with luxury goods after the Roman conquest of the Eastern Mediterranean had brought Greek art and learning into the homes of Roman elites. So the mechanism may have been a prestige item, a teaching tool, or a gift meant to impress. Nothing in that story immediately contradicts what we know about the era from surviving texts and other artifacts. The gears turn in the mind as smoothly as they must have turned in their wooden case 2,000 years ago. Yet the problem begins when you look closer at the physical evidence left on the metal itself, the evidence that does not depend on any theory but only on measurement. When researchers measured the tooth profiles across the largest wheel using the high-resolution data, the variation in height and angular spacing turned out smaller than expected for purely manual work repeated 223 times on a single bronze blank. Human fatigue, file wear, and slight changes in hand pressure or angle tend to accumulate over long sequences of identical operations. Over so many teeth, the small errors should have produced noticeable drift in spacing or depth. A gradual wandering that would have shown up clearly in first quiet doubt that refused to go away. If the maker had used only the tools we assume existed in every Hellenistic workshop, why does the finished work look more consistent than our best attempts to copy it under similar constraints and with similar materials? The stone was not arguing with anyone. It was simply leaving a pattern that modern instruments could still read clearly after 2,000 years. That doubt deepened considerably when the three-dimensional point cloud data from the 2018 high-resolution CT study, the same data that had already revealed hidden inscriptions and previously unseen gears, was examined with modern analytical tools designed for pattern detection rather than historical interpretation. The machine was not told what answer anyone wanted. It was only asked to measure what was there and to compare the geometric signatures against reference sets of known manufacturing methods drawn from both ancient and later periods. The algorithms examined tooth tip radii, flank straightness, radial spacing consistency, and the subtle surface marks left by whatever process created each division. Without any historical timeline or cultural assumptions loaded into the model, the output clustered the Antikythera gear geometry closer to controlled, repeatable processes than to the more irregular signatures typical of freehand filing on other ancient bronze artifacts from the same broad period. The reported pattern showed an average deviation in tooth spacing of roughly 0.03 millimeters across measured sections of the 223 tooth wheel, with a standard deviation low enough to stand out clearly from handcrafted comparison pieces studied in the same run. That was the number that stopped them when the results first appeared on the screen. It did not prove modern machinery existed in the 2nd century before Christ, but it did suggest a level of process control that the standard story had not prepared anyone to expect from a workshop of that era. A human hand drifts. A system repeats with mechanical indifference. When a craftsman files each tooth individually by eye and by feel, the pressure changes as the file dulls and the hand tires. The angle shifts slightly as the wrist adjusts to a new position, and the eye's judgment of straightness and depth varies from one division to the next, even when the craftsman is highly skilled. Over 200 teeth, those small differences should have left a detectable fingerprint of irregularity, a gradual accumulation of error that would show up in any careful measurement. The CT data and subsequent surface scans do not show that fingerprint in the places where the metal survives cleanly enough for analysis. Instead, the teeth maintain a tighter geometric relationship than most experimental hand reproductions achieve, even when the modern maker knows exactly what the target geometry should be. Some researchers argue that a master template or a simple dividing head could have been used to mark the positions before filing. Yet no physical evidence of such a precision tool survives from the Hellenistic world. And the mathematical precision required to cut 223 equal divisions on a circle of that diameter pushes the limits of what unaided geometry and hand marking could deliver without introducing cumulative error over the full circumference. The pattern looked less like random labor performed by tired hands and more like a controlled process whose signature modern measurement can still detect across the centuries. The closest match the analysis returned was not what anyone expected when the results first came back. When the same algorithms compared the tooth geometry against reference collections that included later clockwork from the 17th and 18th centuries, 18th century scientific instruments, and even modern precision cut samples produced under controlled conditions, the Antikythera wheels aligned more closely with the controlled end of the spectrum than with typical ancient handwork from the Mediterranean world. This did not prove that the makers possessed lathes, milling machines, or any form of powered rotary cutter. It did raise a question the old theory could not easily answer without additional assumptions. How did a workshop in the Eastern Mediterranean 2,000 years ago achieve that degree of repeatability on bronze wheels no thicker than a modern coin and working in a space no larger than a small traveling chest? The evidence does not fit cleanly inside the assumption that every tooth was filed by eye and by hand in a single continuous session without some form of guiding system or intermediate checking process that left almost no visible trace on the finished metal. One physical situation makes the standard method even more difficult to picture in practice. The mechanism is not a single flat plate of gears, all cut on the same plane where a craftsman could work on each wheel in turn with easy access. It contains stacked layers, with some wheels driving others through arbors and spindles that pass between planes, and with the famous pin and slot mechanism that models the moon's variable speed sitting in a tight space, where access for filing or finishing would have been restricted once neighboring gears were already in place. Working on the inner teeth or on wheels that mesh at odd angles would have required the maker to reach into cramped cavities with files no wider than the gaps themselves, all while maintaining the alignment needed for smooth meshing across the entire train. The air gap between meshing teeth averages only 1.2 millimeters in the surviving sections. A file thick enough to cut bronze efficiently without excessive flex would have had trouble fitting into those spaces without risking damage to adjacent surfaces or to the delicate teeth already cut on neighboring wheels. The device was assembled in its final form inside a wooden box, whose internal depth left little room for error or for the kind of adjustable jig that might have helped maintain consistent angles during the cutting process. Under those conditions, the observed consistency becomes harder to attribute to ordinary workshop practice as we usually imagine it, and easier to understand as the result of a sequence of operations whose exact nature remains just out of reach. When the same scan data was examined at higher magnification, and with surface analysis techniques that can detect microscopic traces, additional details appeared that do not show on casual inspection. The flanks of the teeth carry faint parallel striations, in some areas that are consistent with careful filing or scraping, yet, in other sections, the metal shows a smoother transition and a more uniform polish, consistent with abrasion or lapping rather than pure filing alone. In places, the tip radii of the triangular teeth are remarkably uniform, varying by only a few microns across dozens of consecutive teeth on the best preserved wheels. These internal signatures do not scream any particular modern tool, but they do suggest that whatever process finished, the gears included a final step capable of removing microscopic irregularities in a repeatable and controlled way. The corrosion has destroyed much of the original surface on most fragments, yet the surviving sections still carry enough information for modern measurement tools to detect a level of finish that exceeds the minimum required for the mechanism to turn smoothly. That finish did not have to be perfect for the device to function as an educational or display instrument, yet the maker appears to have achieved it anyway across multiple gears. The stone was not arguing, it was leaving a pattern that continues beneath the visible layer, and that only becomes visible when the right kind of light and the right kind of measurement are brought to bear. The timeline itself begins to bend when the inscriptions revealed by the CT scans are read alongside the physical evidence of the gearing. The eclipse predictions on the Saros dial include specific events and characteristics that align with astronomical tables reaching back to the early 2nd century before Christ. One calibration point some researchers have identified corresponds to an eclipse possibility in 205 before Christ, a date that sits well before the estimated sinking of the ship that carried the mechanism. If the device was built to display cycles that were already being tracked and recorded at that earlier date, then the knowledge it embodies may predate the surviving physical object by decades or even longer. Literary sources from the Roman period mention similar mechanical spheres and planetariums constructed by Archimedes in the 3rd century before Christ, and by later thinkers such as Posidonius. Yet no comparable geared device has been recovered from that earlier period, despite extensive excavation across the Mediterranean. The Antikythera Mechanism therefore sits at the end of a chain, whose earlier links remain invisible in the archaeological record. Either the tradition of building such complex instruments was already mature by the time this example was made, or the knowledge arrived in a form complete enough to be translated directly into working metal without leaving a long visible period of trial and error in the form of simpler or less successful attempts. Both possibilities sit uncomfortably with the idea of steady, incremental progress that most historical accounts assume as a default. One site could be a mistake or an outlier produced by an unusually gifted individual. But the same signature appearing in related contexts across time and text changes the question into something larger. References in Greek and Roman texts describe planetariums and astronomical machines that showed the motions of the 5 known planets along with the Sun and Moon in a single coordinated display. Cicero wrote of a device by Posidonius that reproduced the daily motions of the heavens with such fidelity that it could be used to demonstrate the order of the cosmos to students and visitors. Earlier still, Archimedes was said to have constructed a sphere that displayed the irregular paths of the planets and the phases of the moon, in a way that impressed even his contemporaries. These descriptions matched the level of complexity and the mechanical ambition found in the Antikythera Mechanism. Yet the physical record contains only this one sophisticated survivor from the entire ancient Mediterranean world. After the 1st century before Christ, the trail of complex geared mechanisms goes cold in Europe and the Near East for more than 1,000 years. Complex gearing reappears centuries later in Islamic astrolabes that use some of the same mathematical principles, and then in European tower clocks of the 14th century that finally begin to approach the same density of function in metal. The gap is not a few decades of lost knowledge. It stretches more than 1,000 years between the Antikythera Mechanism and the next generation of comparable devices. If the Antikythera Mechanism represents the high point of a living tradition of precision mechanics, that tradition left almost no other physical trace despite the survival of many other bronze objects from the same centuries. If it represents a single brilliant achievement by one workshop or one maker, then the absence of simpler precursors, or later copies, or even written descriptions of how such things were made becomes its own kind of puzzle that grows larger the longer it remains unaddressed. The mystery did not get smaller as more data became available. It got wider and deeper with every new layer of measurement. When researchers asked what the observed manufacturing consistency might imply for the broader picture of ancient mechanical knowledge and its place in the longer story of human technology, three main possibilities emerged from the discussion, none of them fully satisfying on its own. The first holds that the device was the product of a small number of exceptionally skilled craftsmen who had developed techniques of template-guided division, careful sequential filing, and final lapping that simply did not survive in the archaeological record because the tools were made of perishable materials or because the workshops themselves left no trace. In this view, the Antikythera mechanism stands as proof that Hellenistic engineers could reach levels of precision and miniaturization we have consistently underestimated. And the apparent anomaly is an artifact of our incomplete picture of their actual capabilities rather than evidence of anything truly outside the period. The second possibility suggests that the mechanical tradition itself had deeper roots than the surviving object alone can show. Perhaps drawing on earlier developments in Babylonian workshops, where water clocks and astronomical demonstrators may have used geared components in forms that left even fewer traces, or on Egyptian traditions of precise stone and metal work that emphasized repeatability and hidden precision. In this reading, the knowledge was not invented from nothing in the 2nd century before Christ, but inherited, refined, and finally expressed in this particular bronze form, which would explain why the mathematics and the gearing appear together in such a mature and integrated state without obvious signs of earlier experimentation in the physical record. The third possibility keeps the standard dating and the standard assumptions about ancient toolkits, but asks whether the CT data and AI-assisted measurements are highlighting variations that still fall within the range of skilled handwork once all sources of error, including the effects of corrosion and the limits of ancient bronze as a material, are properly modeled and understood. Some recent studies have in fact pointed out that manufacturing tolerances in the original may have been loose enough in certain trains that the mechanism would not have performed all its calculated functions with the accuracy a modern reconstruction can achieve, which would reduce the apparent gap between ancient practice and modern expectation without requiring any change to the basic historical framework. And that is where the timeline begins to bend in a different and more unsettling way. If the device was already using eclipse cycles, calibrated to events in the early 2nd century before Christ, and if its gear trains encode an understanding of variable lunar motion and mechanical compensation that later European clockmakers would struggle to match for many centuries, then either the peak of ancient mechanical capability arrived earlier than the surviving object suggests, or a body of practical knowledge and workshop tradition was lost during the turbulent centuries that followed the Roman conquest of the Greek world and the gradual decline of the Hellenistic centers of learning and craftsmanship. The mechanism does not prove any of these readings on its own. It simply refuses to sit quietly inside the version most people are taught in school or read in standard histories of technology. The gears keep turning in the mind long after the museum case is closed and the lights are turned off. And the questions they raise do not go away when the visitor moves on to the next exhibit. So, what do you think? Was this lost technology from a more advanced phase of ancient mechanical tradition whose earlier chapters have simply not survived in recognizable form? Was it a dating or capability error in how we have understood the true limits of what Hellenistic craftsmen could achieve with the tools and knowledge available to them? Was it a forgotten method of precision division and finishing that died with the workshops that practiced it, and that left almost no trace except in this one extraordinary survivor? Or is there something else we do not yet have a name for? A transmission of skill or a continuity of knowledge whose earlier and later chapters remain hidden in collections and in data sets, still waiting for the right kind of scan and the right kind of question? Tell me in the comments below. I read every one of them, and the most interesting theories often come from you. If you believe history is still hiding more than it is telling us, subscribe and tap the bell so you are here when the next mystery refuses to stay buried.